Welcome to Curate Your Career, a museum career podcast about staying, leaving, and everything in between. I'm Elin Philby, museum educator turned career coach.
And I'm Allie Shell, career coach specifically for museum professionals. And we're here to talk about all the messy, exciting, and sometimes confusing parts of working in museums.
Each week, we'll share stories, real advice, and quick wins to help you figure out your next move, whether that's staying, leaving, or just making your current job work better for you.
So let's dive in, because if there's one thing museum professionals are great at, it's overthinking. We're here to help you think smarter, not spiral. So take a breath and let's get started. Welcome back, everybody. We have an amazing guest with us today that I got to witness at the Small Museum Association conference that I attended in February. And her talk has stuck with me that I just cannot shake it from my mind. And who we have with us today was our plenary speaker at the conference. Her name is Ashley Witherspoon. She is with Handmade Dreams. What she shared has now influenced how I am thinking about some aspects of the coaching that I do for museum workers. The conversation we're going to have today, I think, is something that is going to be really big for museum workers in the field, leaving the field, honestly, anybody. It's really good mindset work. And so it's a lot of things that are going to matter to you and matter deeply.
Yeah, Allie was at the Small Museum Conference and she texted me and she was like, "We got to have Ashley on the podcast. This is the best talk I've ever been to." And you were just like texting me excited and so inspired. And I'm so ready to have this conversation about emotional labor, invisible labor, and how museum professionals can better recognize and communicate the impact of their work and their worth. I work with working with people leaving the field, we try and add metrics when we can to our resumes, right? And museum work just doesn't always lend itself to a number. So talking today about that worth and that impact and how we can talk about it in a more effective way. Ashley, we are so excited that you are here to join us on this conversation.
Welcome to the podcast.
Yay!
Yes, thank you for having me. I am excited. I am a licensed clinical social worker, which I'm excited about and proud of. And I've recently entered into the space within the last couple of years working with museums. And initially, I started working with visitors, right? And how we can create safe spaces for them and really start conversations around exhibitions that are related to mental health and communities within our communities that might not initially think about visiting a museum, but giving them another portal entryway into connecting with what we have. And so that was my kind of intro into museum life. And over time, I developed great relationships with museum workers, and a lot of their work sounded similar to mine. I had been working in federal service and healthcare for over a decade, working with families and caregivers. And we know that that is a very high impact lane, right? Where there's lots of burnout, lots of exhaustion, lots of responding to community crises at times. And so I was like, wow, you guys have a pretty high impact job as well. You are facing the community, you're making visitors feel comfortable, making sure that they're educated in what they're seeing, how they're feeling throughout the experience, but also all of the work to get that done, right? The community sees so much on the surface. And I was talking to my new museum friends and they were saying, my goodness, let me tell you about all of the things that hold this institution up. So I was so excited when you invited me to SMA. Intimate it was, how I got to speak with so many people over dinner and even outside of the talk and really feel as though, hey, this resonated with me, this landed with me. So I'm excited that I had the opportunity.
I'll tell you, small museum workers who are a lot of times really embedded in their communities, you picked like the perfect topic, the perfect avenue. I could just tell looking around the room, I've been involved in this conference for a long time, that everyone was just like on the edge of their seat. I had tears in my eyes. We're going to go through some of the stuff that you went over, but I just had tears in my eyes the whole time because the emotional labor that we do is just not measured or not valued. We all, I think a lot of us really felt seen in that moment. And also you gave us, I'm a practical person and the whole small museum community are a practical bunch of people. So you gave us also a lot of tools and things to think about. Um, that, oh my gosh, it was so good. A follow-up question for you. So how did you stumble on museums? Like what drew you to them to really start thinking about them as a space that you want to get involved in?
Yeah, so I actually visited a museum in my home state in North Carolina. And was a visitor myself. I was walking around looking at different pieces, and I came across a piece that was very intriguing to me. And I just remember having an emotional response to this. I think it was around COVID. And I was like, wow, like, this piece makes me feel this way. I wonder how everyone else is feeling. And I just remember not really having that connection of or insight to say, okay, I'm going to talk to my neighbor. Right. And so at the time, the driver was, hey, let's create community, but let's also create conversation. I wonder how many other people want to talk about this piece too. And so I approached the museum and I was like, hey, I have an idea. And I want to call it the Art Wellness Exchange. Would you be interested? And they were like, okay, I guess so. Let's see how this goes. And so I curated an experience with caregivers in every capacity, whether they were first time parents, whether they were healthcare responders at the time, whether they were caring for their loved ones with dementia or any other cognitive challenge. And so I just remember we held a 3-month long series. And by the end of the 3 months, people were coming together. They were arriving together. They had eaten dinner together. And these are people that I feel like would normally see one another, maybe in the grocery store or passing, but they would have never communicated, right? And so after that experience, I was like, okay, this is something, right? I think after coming out of COVID, people really wanted to connect again and they really wanted to have spaces of empathy. Maybe everyone wasn't experiencing the same thing, but they could identify over an emotion and it kind of created a life from there.
I think this is so important. This is for me, I'm like, this is the work that museums overall need to be doing of all sizes in our communities. The shift really needs to happen, and it's not happening fast enough, in my opinion, or enough. In advocacy and community support, we see it more with like libraries really holding that place in communities. There are some museums that are doing an amazing job of this, and more museums, I'm like, you need to get on board with this. And I like too that you, and we'll get more into this, but you're both looking and like wellness in museums in terms of both the visitor and the visitor experience, but then also the museum worker as well. Can you tell me more about like what types of museums you've worked with? I know that you've also spoken at other conferences or led other workshops. So would just love to hear a little bit more about and give a chance to brag about the work that you have done
Yeah,
with museums.
absolutely. Yes. So I've worked with different types of museums, of course, art museums, but also historical museums, right? There are, museum workers that really hold the truths in our communities. And I've had the opportunity to visit their spaces. And there's some really cool spaces out there. Like, I want to shout out to Durham, North Carolina. There's a small history museum there, and they have oh gosh, what are their names? They're from Stranger Things, right? The show, they have two producers that come from that part of North Carolina, and they really pay homage and highlight that particular series on Netflix. But they actually utilized that series to create a connection point to the community. Right. And they really drove home the experience of COVID and, comparing it to like Stranger Things and how people coped with that during that time, right? And all of the changes and transitions. And so I thought that was such a cool way to bring in not only community history, right? But also bringing in a wellness layer to that. Like, how did this impact us? What stories do we have to tell? So that was really cool. I really enjoyed working with them. But, on a more national or larger scale, I've worked with Alliance, and that's been really cool in the sense of writing publications for them around professional experiences and just navigating those professional experiences in our workspaces. Like, how do we get overwhelmed, or the term of burnout, right? Like, how do we rest our senses? Do we just take that summer vacation or wait until spring break? Or are we taking small times and bits to ourselves throughout the day? Right? If we're on the computer all day, how are we resting our eyes? If we're talking all day, we might want to sit in silence, right? Or have some time to ourselves. And so, really taking another approach on rest and what that might look like in our everyday. So, I've been able to kind of touch on some really cool focus points, areas that I think are just far beyond what many people in our organizations are on right now. So that's been a gift that I've enjoyed. Yeah. I think this last episode, they had their high school teacher come onto the show who actually, I think she just retired from the school that they went to in that community. So I thought that was really cool as well. I think the museum just really took advantage of such a great opportunity. And for the kids, right? To kind of like, how do you bring parts of the community into the space who may never really say, oh, I'm going to go there on my own, right? So you've touched on a whole new demographic, which I thought was cool. And we could sprinkle in mental health and wellness as well.
Yeah, I think a lot of times museums and other cultural organizations don't always think about themselves as a social conduit, right? Like, I had an old director who would always say it's always easier to talk to another person if you both have dogs, or like if you both have kids, right? Because there's this social connection point where you're like, oh, you have a dog or you have kids. Okay, like we have something in common. And so that's a really interesting case study of museums acting as that social conduit through a shared interest and experience. That's really cool. And I think you guys are thinking of the Duffer Brothers, the guys who created the show.
Yes, that's
That's
it.
it. That is
Mhm.
it.
Yes. Yes. Ellie
I
and
was
I
like,
are
I
both
know
big
it's
Stranger Things fans.
so in a similar thread, I was just this like popped into my brain, but from your background working with like healthcare workers and them dealing with similar things like burnout and just overall like mental health and wellness support, what do you see that is being provided to them or not? And comparing that to what you are seeing being provided or not to museum workers, right? So like comparing these two different fields that have a similarity in terms of like the work they are providing to the public and the workers then also being on the receiving end um, of burnout, of, the emotional labor and what similarities are there or what, maybe it's like what museums should be actually providing for their workers in terms of support.
Yes. Oh my goodness. So I would say that I think both organizations are really operating out of a lack of, right? Like there's always a lack of people, there's a lack of financial resources, like there's a lack of time, right? Also, for some organizations, there is either a high turnover or again, just like a lack of people. So just keeping knowledge I think is another thing that everyone struggles with is, that person that has all of the knowledge all of a sudden leaves and then everyone's always feeling like they have to start over. And so that can create spaces that just really, as we think about psychological safety, right? I think a lot of people might start to feel on edge. But in a pro sense, I feel like people in these organizations are really much more tied to the people that they serve, right? So, like in healthcare, we saw that over and over again through COVID. And I'm sure we can go back to other like community, like health crises where healthcare workers are going to come together. They're going to get the job done. They have the expertise. They're going to also support one another. And as I started, speaking with museum professionals, I also felt this like really strong dedication to the community, right? Like, no matter what happens to me, like, I'm just here to make sure the visitors are taken care of, that the knowledge gets disseminated. And I also feel like museum workers as well have just like a really, really high expertise in what they do. I'm coming in from a mental health side, but I always like to say this is a collaboration. And I've met so many like friends in this process because I couldn't do it without them. The high level of expertise is just, you just can't replace it. So I would say that's definitely the similarities that I see. But I think the ongoing thread of turnover and burnout in both fields are just like the support, right? The value, the worth that we kind of got into at SMA is, how do people feel valued at the end of the day, right? And how are their organizations either pushing that value so that people are like, okay, I feel good, I feel rewarded, or they're kind of pushing people out.
Because it's funny, my husband is in healthcare and it's like we both have this like underlying core value of care and empathy. We both of us exist to serve others. That is just like a core part of our personalities. And that's so funny to like hear these parallels be talked about because I've never thought about our relationship existing in that way. And so what have you seen from the healthcare side that could be implemented in museums?
Yeah, I think one is healthcare, they have no choice to really rely on different areas of healthcare. So, for example, when I was there, although I was a social worker, I was also training medical staff, right? Future doctors and interns and residents that were coming over. We had to kind of swap our expertise in a way to support each other, right? They're coming in with, okay, I know this surgical procedure, but I'm coming in with, hey, how do we respect people when we go into their room? Let's talk about intergenerational relationships, right? And what we might expect from someone who might have been through the Vietnam War versus someone that might be a millennial or a Gen Z, right? And how can we connect? Because there are some differences there, right? Even in communication style. But what are some of the values like you talked about that we can connect over and that we can start to build mutual respect and care for this person, right? So I think that within that, we had to communicate with other areas of healthcare. We couldn't stay in our lane. We couldn't stay siloed to make the whole thing work. And so that's something that I do feel as healthcare workers, we were always doing. We were touching points throughout the entire day. We were going to a lot of interdisciplinary meetings. We were talking to visitors together. There wasn't always this hierarchy. It was kind of like across the board. Yeah.
Oh my gosh. I just feel so seen. And it's just a whole different perspective of looking at the work that we do. I don't know. It's just so fascinating. And now my brain is just going to spiral out thinking about all the comparisons and looking at healthcare models and incorporating some of them more into the museum sector, and hoping people listening, especially those in positions of power, can take some of this and implement it within their structures. I realize for our audience, we might need to define a little bit of what emotional labor looks and sounds like. So if there are some things that you can share, I know like you did an amazing job in your talk of really outlining a lot of different areas. Are you able to share a little bit about what that might look like for museum workers?
Yeah, yeah, of course. In our talk, I used the iceberg as an example to give people a visual of what this might look like, right? So when we think about an iceberg, we have a small piece of ice, like at the very top, that most of us can see. And then under that piece of ice is a larger block of ice, which may expand or go as deep as sometimes we don't know, right? But a lot of times the piece of ice at the top is in no comparison to what's under the water line. And so, above the water line, to give folks a context, is it's going to be the programs, it's going to be the exhibitions, the visitor interactions, the deliverables, the public facing success that people see. Right. But below the waterline, that's where we get into the emotional labor, the invisible labor, the community care, the cultural translation, boundary holding, crisis response. So that's what we're going to see underneath, that everyone isn't gonna really understand, right, when they walk into the museum. So emotional labor is like absorbing like feelings or soothing conflict. It's supporting visitors, right? Like that's the emotional labor that you're taking on. So if someone's walking into the museum, you guys have a new exhibition, and a visitor might not like that, right? They might say, "Well, no, that's not it. You should have done it this way." That's kind of the emotional labor that you guys are going to be taking on, right? How do you de-escalate some of this steam that this person is coming into our organization with? But it might not just be visitors. I mean, this could come from board members. This could come, from someone on an executive team, right? And it may not be related just to an exhibition, but it could be related to anything, any system that you might have in place that you are having to navigate these waters in regards to people's responses and what might come out of that.
Yeah. And museums are still so rooted in their colonial legacies, white supremacy that, unfortunately, like you encounter as a museum worker all these and more. And I feel like training is such a big part of that does not happen in museums. So Ela and I talk a lot about like just simply like management training. Like a lot of people in the field move up into manager roles and that training doesn't often happen for them. And it's like all goes back to like the support system. Same thing for, sometimes I know there are exhibits that have a more, emotional component, or maybe they're more either like politically charged or just are dealing with some difficult topics that sometimes the museum will provide some additional training. And sometimes they don't, just in general, right? Like, and I just feel like overall, right, there needs to be just like de-escalation training just on a lot of the things that you are mentioning and more. And that just does not happen, that type of support. That could be like one step that needs to happen out of all of this is like, how do we just like give them all the tools in their toolbox to be able to do this? Or, where can they go? Who can they go to in the museum? That is, I also think about like safe spaces for museum workers and museums, and safety looks different for everybody, right? So, yeah, I just wish that we could provide a better world for that, especially when we are taking on so much emotional labor.
And I think too, like this most heavily impacts our early career front of house people too, right? Because they are getting the brunt of that visitor interaction for good and for bad, right? Like thinking about, the beginning of my career when I was front of house, and like nobody ever taught me about de-escalation or about like how to handle angry people. Like, and I'm like this like early 20s girl, and I'm like, I don't know. And that emotional labor is hard because you come home at the end of the day and you're like, ugh, I just like you can't, it's just that front facing work just doesn't get the support. And I could see that too then, like leading to that burnout. I mean, I felt it, right? Like leading to that burnout, leading to the emotional distress. Like I used to have panic attacks before our board meetings because our board was so toxic. It's what you're doing is so important, Ashley, and I really, this conversation needs to keep happening in these trainings and these skill sets need to be taught, so that as a field we can move forward more holistically and more in a more healthful way.
Absolutely. I think that we also have to get out of the mindset, and, healthcare does this too, where we have like these yearly trainings, right? I think we need to get into the mindset of incorporating this type of language in your supervisor meeting, right? In your team meetings, in your meetings with the board, right? Like people need to have a toolkit essentially. It's like we know that it's coming, we know it's coming. It's like looking outside or looking at the weather forecast. We know it's going to rain. We know it might be cold. And we have to have the supplies to get ready for it. So we're going to have our jacket. We're going to have an umbrella. We're going to have our boots. I think it's the same in our organizations where we know that working with visitors, working with patients, there might be conflict. We know that when we are, having to go to higher ups for permission or grants or funding, that there could be conflict, right? And how are we preparing ourselves? But also, how are we using similar language? Right? How are we using language that transcends on both ends? I give a great example of, a lot of people would agree that one value they would like to see or implement in their daily lives is respect, right? Well, respect can look so different depending on, what region of the country you're in, right? If you're in the South, you're going to say yes, ma'am, or yes, sir. If you're in the North, people are like, do not ever say that to me again, right? So it's going to depend on where you are and what that means. And so I think that our below the waterline is, with emotional labor or invisible labor, all of those things, moving that above the surface and explaining to people what that is, right? If you are a front desk person, right? And you see visitors, you have a relationship with them, and you notice that you have to de escalate an event. You might say, okay, I have to move from this job and go over here and make sure that people feel safe, making sure that you're de escalating any conflict that might arise. That should be moved above your waterline. That should be included in your metrics when you go in front of your supervisor. Hey, I de escalated 3 events this week, right? I would like that to be included in my performance review. But also in your job descriptions, we also need to prepare people, right? We can't just say, hey, you're going to sit at this front desk. It's going to be great. We also have to say, okay, these are some things that could possibly be presented in front of you, and let me help you with that. Let me make sure you're prepared. Let me make sure that you know where to go if things don't work out in the way that's right. I think these are ways that we can take just us talking about it to putting it into action. It's very important.
Well, and shifting. Oh my gosh. My mind is going like 50 miles a minute because it's so important. And I feel like just going off the job descriptions little thread that you pulled, so many job descriptions in the field are just like a wish list, a list of duties. And yeah, letting people know, like that to me is always like being very specific as to like, okay, they say that, you're going to be standing for so many hours or, doing this sort of physical task or something like that. Like, what does that actually entail instead of just being like, oh, you got to lift, 25, be able to lift 25 pounds, right? Same thing, like you were mentioning, how can we prepare people and not just put the other duties as assigned, not just sitting at the front, greeting guests as they arrive. Like, what does that actually mean? And then places providing that support. And we will, train you on this. We will, anything else, any kind of other support that they can provide. Like that, oh my gosh, like what a change that would be to see job descriptions like that in the field and know that like a place has your back and will support you and also like mentally prepare you for the scenario you're going to work in. We receive an average of, 1,000 people a day, right? Like it's also like a different like emotional shift too, in terms of like, at a small museum, I was just dealing, it's different levels, right? Different levels of the close connection I'm going to have with the low number of visitors, but the repeat visitors that come back because we're a safe space or a favorite place in the community versus just volumes of people. I love that so much. Can we
Yeah.
please make that happen?
Right. It's like along with the physical labor component, there's like an emotional labor addition of like, yeah. Well, and because like, the only museum I've ever encountered where I know for a fact they do that type of training for staff is the 9/11 museum. Cause I was offered a job there out of grad school, and part of like them talking about it was like, oh, and we give you training on de-escalation and how to deal with like people who are disruptive during the tour or who, because it's a very sensitive content area, right? So,
Yeah.
um,
Yeah.
but and it's interesting too, like also then I worked at a children's museum and I also had really disgruntled people there. So it's like, why do like are you seeing, Ashley, like more organizations starting to offer this kind of training for people? Is this a need in the field? Can you talk about that?
Definitely think that it's a need,
Yeah.
right? And I compare this to um my field with social work. I think coming through school, a lot of us are told or taught, we're like, okay, pick which population you want to work with. Do you want to work with children? Do you want to work with, people that have substance challenges? Like, who do you want to work with? And I think this is not a realistic way to set people up, right? Because we are complex. People are complex. You can have 8 populations within one person alone. Like people don't come in like really neat boxes. And that's okay. That's what makes us human. That's what makes us exciting. That's what makes, everything interesting, right? But I also would say the similar for museums, as you described. It's like, okay, this type of museum is focusing on really sensitive topics, but guess what? There's so many other museums focusing on sensitive topics as well. Maybe it is not, um, you know, as impactful, of course, as 9/11 in the sense of, how many lives and how destructive it was on that day. But, there are people that come into children's museums, we know, like they might think children should learn this way or they should learn that way. I mean, there can always be something that comes up. And so I think that we should be prepared to work with any situation, any conflict. And we're truly not. We're not prepared at all. Until it happens, I think that's where we start to chase fires. And that was one of my reasons of I love healthcare. Believe me, I loved my families. I loved my patients. It was very rewarding. But one thing that I wanted to do with my platform with Handmade Dreams is to create a space where we're more proactive, right? Where we're not chasing fires after it's happened. I think that we should go ahead and prepare. And so, no, I'm not seeing a lot of organizations prepare up front. It's like this happened. Now we have to gather our resources. And even once that happens, it wears off after a while, where it's like, hey, we want you to come in and talk to this group of people because this happened. And then after that, it's like a check. Like, okay, that we had that training and now we can move on. It has to be in the systems. It has to be in every conversation for people to really feel comfortable with it.
Yeah, succession, like things like succession planning, proactive planning is just not something that's baked into so many museums because they don't want to, again, we're on like the hamster wheel and it's not often valued as like things that are flashier, right? Like working on programs and fundraisers and things that are really visible to the public and to funders and board members, but so much of like the internal structure is so important and building in time for staff too to be able to participate in and build in that time to get training or plan for the next thing. So many places don't do that. It's so
No.
needed.
And this is where I really feel as though it's important to to collaborate, right? Collaborations are so important because I hear wellness. Wellness is like a buzzword right now. A lot of people are using it, and I think it's great. Like it's bringing more awareness. But I also caution everyone to say, okay, when we're bringing up this type of language, how are we being ethical about implementing wellness? So we're inviting people into our spaces, we're unpacking some things, and then, sometimes it goes well, and then sometimes it takes a turn. And how are we addressing that? How are we connecting people once they leave this space to make sure they're taken care of, right? Like we can't take band-aids off and then say, thank you for coming. We'll see you next Saturday. It's like, we have to make sure that people feel as though they're taken care of and our staff, right? Like sometimes you can set staff to go in and lead a program and they come out and they're like, oh my gosh, I didn't feel prepared, or I needed more resources. And so collaboration is very important, I think, in this regard.
Yeah, and I want to share a little bit about I was talking to my former boss about your presentation at SMA because she usually came with me and she just retired this past year and I was like relaying all, the greatest hits of the conference and I was sharing about your concept of the iceberg and the emotional labor and I knew this because it was just the two of us on staff for a long time. We had a really big volunteer core. We had about 90 active volunteers and she would always make time. There would be like several that would like just come up, find her office. Her and I always had so much work to do. And same with me too, right? We would just like, we're like, okay, part of what our work is just making space for our volunteers and, not just the work that they do there, but their own lives and things going on as museums are often the keeper of places, just like you're mentioning, like processing people's joys and griefs and successes and disappointments and everything in between. And so we were often that space for our volunteers as well. And she was like, I would always just like make time for them. They had a little chair, she would always have her containers of treats on the counter. But out of that, right? And she's like, I always would make the point to the board that this is like an important part of what I do. Not to say that she was doing this to get money out of people, but because she took that time, they would often, the people that she was connecting with overall, they would leave us in their wills when they moved on or passed on. They would, increase donations or just simply, spend extra time here. And this became a reason why we had so many volunteers that were with the organization 20 plus years. And it's that kind of care that we do. And I'm so glad that she made a point to the board that like the emotional work that I do is actually like a core part. And here is how this is quantifiable. And I think where museums kind of get stuck on the, a metrics part or, performance aspect, right? Because a lot of the work that Ela and I did, everything's about numbers, right? And I think it comes down to like, that's easy ways of measuring, not just to like funders, board members, even other staff members, but even grants. Grants are so reliant on that. And I will like, again, plea out to anybody working on grants, like it would be amazing to shift that out of the metrics and figure out ways that we can still measure, quote unquote, community impact, which is just, it's so tough to shift away from that just because so much is that's easy. That's easy to measure. But I think even greater than that is the impact and the support that we provide our community.
Yeah. I mean, earlier how I gave the example about conflict, how to regulate like any type of escalation. I think as well as like cultural and language, translation that someone might be performing on their job, right? Like making sure they're bringing that up to say, okay, this is part of my workload. If that's not in your job description, right? And you find yourself doing a lot of this cultural work or translation work, that should be included. And I think that should be, part of the metrics. And it could also be like, sometimes you have people in your institutions that might be from the area, right? They're like third or fourth generation families that live in the area. Now they're working in the museum. And so again, it's like identity labor, like, oh, you're from here. You know where that thing is by the thing. And, that again should be something else that's brought above the waterline in terms of how do we include this in this person's metrics, or even just like in an executive level, right? Like making sure you're bringing that up to board members to say like, hey, identity labor is high at our museum, right? And I always like to say every museum I've worked with has their own culture. So depending on where you are, some things might be higher than others. You might have different types of visitors, right? One museum might have more senior visitors, another museum might have like younger folks that come through. And so, but with that comes different challenges and different pros, right? So we should be tailoring these things. This isn't like a one size fits all. We should be tailoring all of this to the organization that you're with.
Yeah. Ela, do you have a thought?
No, yeah, I guess it's just like I would love to tie this into, our bigger picture here and talk about like the worth. And so we've talked about how museum workers can start to take stock of this emotional labor, this invisible labor, working to make it visible. And then how can they start to move this forward to a better quality of life, a better workplace, to however they might want to implement this new knowledge? How can we move this into action?
Yeah, absolutely. So, in regards to worth, I started out the conference and really just asking everyone, how do they define worth, right? Is worth something that we're born with, or is it something that we develop over time? And, the perspective that I took with this is that we're all born with worth. Right? We're all born with it, no matter who you are. We're all born with our own gifts. But sometimes we learn about worth through our family. We learn about it through school, museum culture, right? Your organization might teach you what worth is. And when you look at the dictionary, you can see the tension because worth is defined as like, what do you bring to the table? Your usefulness, how purposeful, value. Like you start to see all of these things tied to worth. And so this is something that we take into our places of work, right? Like, how do we talk to ourselves, right? And I gave the example of like, if you drop something on the floor, what does your inner voice say? Does it say, you're so clumsy? Or does it say, oh, we made a mistake. Let's just clean it up? Like, what do you say to yourself? The boundaries that we implement, the workload, right? The expectations. How do we respond to pressure? Are you the one that shows up early and leaves late because you feel as though your how long you stay or what you do is tied to your worth and how people value you within the workspace? So I ask people to first like identify that within themselves and how they carry that over into their workplace, right? And do you feel the need to justify your own position with numbers? And I think a lot of people were in agreement that they were like, yeah, we felt like we have to, right? But I think, as we move forward and we talk about how do we implement these things into are these solutions into your everyday workspace? I want to talk about the action of it all, things that we can stop, continue, and start, right? What are things that drain your energy? So, what is one thing that you can stop that undermines your worth, right? Or pulls you away from the work that you're meant to do? So, this could be like saying yes automatically, right? This can be taking on emotional labor that isn't yours or responding after hours, over functioning in under resourced situations, right? These are some things that we might can stop in our places of work. What are some things that we can continue that you're already doing that supports your identity? Right? Grounding before programs, maybe asking clarifying questions, naming the invisible labor, leaning into your strengths. Those are things that we can continue. And then I also talked about what we can start. I think that we can start one new practice, whether that's a boundary or a behavior that we feel like we can support sustainably. So building like micro rest into your day. I think, when I was in healthcare, there is a nurse that I love dearly. Every time we saw her, she would have her backpack chair around lunch and she just left the building and she would go sit out by a tree. And we knew she never told us not to bother her, but we knew like Vanessa's out by a tree. Let's leave her alone. Right. So these are micro rests that she would take. Also, scheduling recovery time. If you are engaged in a huge project, Or let's say you're de escalating something, or you came from a board meeting that was pretty heavy. Are you scheduling time after that to do absolutely nothing, right? To recharge your boundary. I think that's very important for us to do, to actually put that in our day to day. So those are just like a few examples of what we can do. Definitely documenting the impact that you're making. If there are things that you are questioning, should I write that? Absolutely. You should say every single thing that you're doing, no matter how big or how small, because once you bring it above the waterline, there may be other people in the room that are having similar experiences, which could lead to a larger impact to why we need to get this on our metrics, why we need to let the board know what we're doing, right? Because we're all in assumption land. We're assuming that everyone knows, but the invisible labor really is invisible.
Elin, I wanted to know from your end with your museum workers that you help leave the fields. Is there any threads of this when you're like, hey, what do you want out of your next role? Right? Do some of these things kind of come up of like in terms of like support or even I want them to know as you're going through like their skills, do they talk about some of the invisible labor work that they did?
We never name it as invisible labor, but I need to start doing that because one of the big ones is like, I just want to leave work at work. I just want to go to work, do work, and leave and go home. So that's a big one. Another is, toxic boards. That's always a big one. But something else too that this conversation is really pulling up for me, and it's just this need in the field. No, any museum employee that has ever been properly trained, we always just get pushed into the deep end and like, okay, you got this, right? Okay, great. You way to go. You could do this. I always say pushed into the deep end with one floaty arm. Like it's that's a huge part of this too. And like when I got my first non-museum job and I actually like got properly trained for the first time ever for something, I was like, they're like, oh yeah, you'll train for like 2 weeks just shadowing and then somebody will shadow you for this time and then da da da. And I was like, I mean, I could just like hit the ground running if you guys want me to do that. And they're like, no, it's really important that you take time and you learn. And I'm like, what? So yeah, I think that training part is huge, right? And also like, let's talk about something, and I don't want to say simple in terms of diminishing its importance, but like, this is a thing that museums can do to improve the lives of their workers very immediately is like properly training people. That's really huge. Yeah. And I think too, Ashley, it's like the invisible labor tends to be the stuff that burns us out the most, right? Like, talking about the boards or tricky visitors or building in rest and naming that and understanding. And I think about like in healthcare, like when my husband has like a bad case or like a bad outcome or whatever, they have like mandatory meetings that they have to attend to debrief. And so what if we had that in museums, right? And not just like the meeting after the meeting, where it's like everybody gets together and like SHIT talks, but like an actual, like, let's talk about how this felt, let's debrief. That's really huge. And I think part of the culture of the field is this hustle, grind of like, I have to be continuing to show my worth. And like, we're working very understaffed and under resourced. So I am the one that holds it all together. And I think giving yourself time and space to breathe so that doesn't keep happening because it's hard. It's really hard. And advocating, right? Like I said earlier, I was having panic attacks before board meetings and I sat down with my director and I was like, listen, this is negatively affecting my life. I shouldn't be having a panic attack the Sunday night, every first Sunday night of the month. Like I shouldn't be having a panic attack. I don't think it's worthwhile for me to be in board meetings anymore. And he was like, okay, that's, and so that was also him like acknowledging that and supporting me in that way and being a safe space. Doesn't mean that he stopped having panic attacks before board meetings, but as the executive director, it's like, okay, that was a cultural thing. But anyways.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and I also encourage everybody, when I meet with programmers within museums or people, that are making things for the community, I find that many times people don't leave their offices. Right. And that was one thing, as social workers, I remember in grad school, we had to do like a community analysis. I mean, we had to go way back and figure out when was this community built, who was here, how did it change. It was like a whole thesis, it felt like, right? And we had to actually ride around. Then we had to get in our car and like follow the map, and I thought that was really impactful in terms of figuring out what the community needed before we implemented something that we just wanted to. So, even as we talk about being proactive and thinking about how we can cut down on the stressors that we experience, I think we have what we want, and then the reality of the situation, and then the dissonance in between the two is what creates a lot of like the anxiety and like, anxiousness that we have. And so I think, people getting out of their office, walking down the street, going to parts of the community that may have changed, right? If this town was founded, I don't know, 200 years ago, I'm sure it's changed since the museum has opened. And the population has changed, the age demographics has changed, the cultural demographics. So, really starting to lean into how are we connecting with the people that we're serving? Because the people that are working in the museums are also the people in the community. I think we forget about that part. Again, when COVID happened, it was like, not only were we healthcare professionals serving the community, but people in healthcare were getting COVID. So we found ourselves like at both ends of like, providing care, but also caring for people that were our peers and our colleagues. And so in museum work, I think it's very similar, right? Like many people live in the community that they also serve the visitors. So again, if we're experiencing external stressors as well, some of these stressors are not just coming from inside of the museum, it's coming externally. So if this community is experiencing this crisis or event or pressure, everyone's going to be feeling the pressure. So we can't just expect people to show up and you're like, oh, are you okay? When these things are happening in your community or your town, and we're like told to just kind of keep your head down and keep moving. So I think that's a even bigger stress currently in these times that a lot of museum professionals are also experiencing as well. And I've been shocked because there are some museums that won't put a name to it, right? They won't talk about it, they won't acknowledge it. And therefore, the people in the organizations, are kind of in limbo because they don't know how to move next.
Gosh, so many good points. Well, I want to hear what you are working on next. And before we get there, I just want to synthesize for our listeners a little bit of ways, like putting all the pieces together of like ways that they can track this work and what they can, use that for to advocate for themselves, advocate for the work that they do. Especially because I see a trend right now with hiring, and this goes to your point, Elin, with no training provided. Same with onboarding. Places like that never really happened for me. So like, and I think too, because a lot of places have their pick, right? So they can pick someone that perfectly matches all the parts of the role, which I think is a big no. Like that leaves no room for growth. And unfortunately, like that's easy for places to pick because that person in their mind can step right onto the role. And even if they match all the skills, there should still be onboarding that happens. So anyway, I just think that we need to have a larger shift in the field too, to acknowledging this additional work that people do that might not match check every single box, but oh my God, they are going to be a force for good in your museum because of the work that they do with their community, with other people. So some different ways, and Elin, feel free to weigh in, that you all can kind of track your work first and foremost. I always advocate for a workplace diary. You can hear me talk about it in a bunch of other podcast episodes. So I don't want to go into depth, but just basically a resource where you keep track of all sorts of other metrics and things that you work on, your successes, your challenges. But that's a great place to compile all your things that too, right? Like we mentioned in the beginning, you helped de-escalate 3 situations this week. Explain, you could go into depth there and then condense it down for other things, but put all the details in there. Documenting any sort of times where you've been mentioned positively in visitor feedback, or you've gotten testimonies from partnerships or other people that you've worked with. So collecting those, tracking partnerships. So times that you've worked with the community, times that you helped, so many volunteers navigate this situation or listen to them or whatever it is. I think that's so important. And, you can use these on annual reviews, advocating for yourself, sharing like, yeah, I have all these things measurable things that I did, but then all of these as well, promotion discussions, and then also now translating it to your resumes, cover letters, and interviews. I want to push for that more in my practice, because yeah, I think I need to do that more. Any thoughts, Elin, before we put all this together?
Yeah, I think just again to reiterate the rest part, like your coworker who used to go out and sit under a tree and eat her lunch, like even if it's just 5 minutes after a hard interaction or like giving yourself some breathing room after a program, whatever it might be. It reminds me of that meme of like Bart in Millhouse, and he's like, "This is where I go to cry." And I'm like, like I've had my fair share of cries in museum bathrooms, right? So giving yourself that time and that space to either just do nothing or to have an emotional release that you need to have so that you don't carry it with you. I think that's really important too. And then yeah, Allie, like you said, just making sure your supervisor is aware of the highs and the lows of the visible emotional labor that you are holding.
So Ashley, as we wrap up this episode, I want to hear from you. What's next for you? You mentioned some stuff when we were talking offline, and I want you to plug it, but also really share about how you are expanding the field in your own way. And maybe there's someone listening that would love to have you come to their museum and provide services or give it a new twist.
Yes, so I'm really excited about future projects. Right now I'm working on a project. I'm on an exhibition team and just kind of providing insight into how to build community relationships and outreach. I think that's something that, from a collaboration standpoint, I was definitely shocked, but also honored to be invited on this team to provide that type of work because this particular museum saw that that is a need. That's something that we need to do to build visitor relationships. Also, just, I think many communities want to have conversations. They want to sit, they want to gather, they want to learn. And although we are experts in many ways, I think our visitors are also experts in their own right. And so through the Art Wellness Exchange, that is a way, an intentional program that I've been able to implement in various spaces to help coordinate that attempt, but also working hand in hand, again, collaborating with museum professionals to help see that work come to light. But in terms of like, as professionals, right now I'm working on a museum wellness guide. So this is visitor facing, but it's also going to be a tool that we can use internally as well. So it's going to give resources to museum professionals in regards to how to work with visitors that are coming into our doors from every level. I think that it's important not just for people in the front to know. I think we should know from the top down and bottom up, right? Like it should go across the board so that if anyone has an issue, anyone has a question, they have the ability or the tools in their toolkit to be able to coach and help each other through this process. So I cannot wait to share that with the community. But in the meantime, on LinkedIn, I have everyday care notes available. A new edition comes out every Friday. And it's just an easy, digestible way for people to tap into what is something simple that I can implement in my everyday personal life, right? The human side of work is how I like to put it.
And that's a LinkedIn newsletter you can sign up. So it'll just come to your inbox every Friday, right? It comes out on
Yes.
Fridays, which is like
Yes.
perfect way to end the week. It's like this little glimmer of hope core that comes on my LinkedIn feed. And Oh my gosh, I love all of this so much.
Yeah. And I like how you mentioned glimmer of hope because I know we've talked about a lot of hard stuff, but I also like to share with museums and folks inside of museums, right? Not just visitors, but mental wellness is a spectrum of all emotions. So yes, there is anxiety, there's frustration, but there's also joy, there's also healing. And so with this newsletter and even the museum wellness guide, we're going to be highlighting that as well. We're not always going to be in a dark place. And so I think that's really what brings our professions together is that, yeah, we're going through some stuff a lot of times, but there's also, we have a deep belief, right? A core value that we believe that there is light at the end of the tunnel. And that's what kind of keeps us in the space or as near as the spaces as we possibly can in our
My gosh, this was such a good episode,
Thank you,
Ashley.
Ashley, so much. This is just,
Thank you.
it's so great.
I know. We might have to have a part 2 because I feel like
Yes.
there is so much more we could have talked about. I was like holding myself back because it also was just not triggering. I know is just such a loaded word, but it was triggering in the sense of just making me remember parts of my work that I did and the support I wish I had and now wanting to advocate and hoping that can happen at some point for the field. And knowing there is someone like you out there that is doing that and making space for our fields is just so special and so important.
Oh, thank you so much.
If listeners want to learn more about Ashley's work with Handmade Dreams, want to sign up for her newsletter on LinkedIn and learn more about the Museum Wellness Guide, we'll include it in the show notes. And if you have had moments in your museum career when you realized the impact you were having didn't show up in the metrics, we would love to hear about it. We would love to hear more about the work that you are doing at your museum that doesn't often get included, because it does matter. So I hope that's one thing, at the very least, you take away from today, especially the parts that don't make it into the annual.
Thanks for tuning in to Curate Your Career. We hope today's episode gave you some ideas, encouragement, or at least a little bit of sanity for your museum career journey.
If you love what you heard, the best way to support us is to subscribe, leave a review, or share this episode with a fellow museum professional who might need it.
And don't forget, you can connect with us, send questions, or share your story at curateyourcareerpod@gmail.com or find us on Instagram at Curate Your Career Podcast. Don't forget to fill out our mailbag form and share your questions that might be featured on a future episode.
All right, now go take one small action toward the career you actually want. Don't just survive your museum job, curate it, one step at a time.